I get asked a lot online, how do you create an image that really pops? And specifically with your editing, how do you work an image to the point where it really jumps off the frame at you? And I think it comes down to mastering contrast. I know that a lot of us, when we start out in Photoshop or Lightroom, we find the contrast slider and we jack it all the way up, or we learn just enough about curves to do ourselves some real damage, or we're using apps with the clarity slider that everyone loves to overuse, and we just push it all the way all the time because we think the more contrast we add and the heavier handed we, the more our images will pop. But I think images pop with contrast because we control it. You'll know if you've tried any of those things that your image quickly falls apart if you overdo it, because your colors go to pot, or you start to get haloing around particular elements of your image, or the image itself just starts to break up and you get artifacting. Control with contrast is essential if you want a mature image that still pops off the frame. So what I'm going to show you today are 5 different ways that I add contrast to an image with 5 different layers, going from very, very fine detail right up to coarse contrast. And I add these layers sequentially and then play with the opacity so that I'm adding them with the right mix as well, and I'm doing all this to eye. So I'm going to show you a bit of my process for a color image and a black and white image. And just to say that even though I'm using portraits in this example, it doesn't have to be portraits. This stuff would work with landscapes, with food photography, with street photography, with any sort of photography. This process would work. And hopefully it gives you some ideas, whether you want to use all these layers or all these ways of using contrast, or it just gives you another little idea to add to your process already. Either way, I hope it helps. So let's jump into Photoshop. Okay, so I pulled a couple of images into Photoshop, and they're both images where I've used ambient light and mixed it with strobe. And I often find in images like this that these really need a little bit of help with contrast, because, you know, flaring into the lens and this sort of beautiful wraparound light is lovely, but you kind of need to bring some of that contrast back. So the first thing I always want to do is to duplicate my background layer. And the first sort of contrast that I use is, I mean, traditionally speaking, I suppose people would talk about it as sharpening, but I find that, you know, I mean, sharpening is really just creating more contrast in your fine edge detail anyway. So I sort of include it in my head as one of the sorts of contrast I add. So first of all, after duplicating this layer, I want to go to Filter. I want to go down to High Pass, which is under Other there. And then I want to find the eye on this little preview, because that's going to show me sort of the fine detail I really want to pop in the whole image. Now, if you push your radius up, you get this horrible kind of haloing. Basically what you want to do, and you can't just remember the number I use and punch it in, because it really is different depending on the resolution of the camera you use or the size of the image, is you want to dial it down until you get rid of all that haloing, but you get nice fine black edges on everything in this sort of grayscale image here. So 2.2 is looking pretty good to me. So if I hit OK, and then I come down here to my blend mode and I use overlay. Let's try overlay. If I zoom into the eye here, you can see what it's done. If I turn this on and off, there you can see the edge detail. You can see it's a little bit fuzzy on these eyelashes, but just to add this very fine contrast, which again is sharpening in effect, because that's what you're seeing. You can turn this on and you can see it's really added a lot of contrast to all those fine details. Off, on, off, on. Now, when you look at this, it might be a little too much. It's a little too over sharpened. So all you're going to do is take your opacity layer and you're going to drag it down until it looks good. So I would probably put this somewhere at about 62. Let's take it to 65 on this image. So you can see that's just giving me a nice bit of very, very fine edge contrast. And the layers that I'm going to show you, we're going to build up the strength of contrast, but I always want to start with my sharpening first. If this was a portrait you were retouching, I would suggest that you then mask out the actual skin on this, so that you're not sharpening skin detail, you're just sharpening features like hair and eyes and lips. But again, like if you're doing a landscape or a street photo, you probably want to apply that through the whole thing. So that's your first one. So let's call this extra fine detail. So this is my first level of contrast, extra fine contrast. The second layer I want to add, I'm going to go Control Alt Shift E or Command Alt Shift E on a Mac to duplicate everything above. So this is called a stamp visible layer. It takes everything underneath and puts it on top. And this layer I'm going to call my fine detail. Yeah, fine detail. So this is my fine contrast layer, and you're going to see what this does. For this layer, I'm going to go into my image adjustments and I'm going to come down to black and white. It's going to turn the image black and white. We're still going to keep this a color image. I'll show you a black and white conversion in a minute. But let's keep this a color image, but I'm going to use this black and white layer. And what I'm going to do is take my reds, especially this is great for portraits, this little formula, but again, if you're shooting landscapes or street, you're going to have to play with this to find the amount of edge detail and contrast that you want. So I'm going to, for skin, I always dial my reds to the left and I push my yellows to the right to create some nice contrast in the skin. But if you are on a landscape, you're going to want to play with your greens. It's not going to do much in this image, or your cyans for your sky. The point is to pull these around so that you're creating contrast. You're not looking for a good looking black and white, because obviously this is looking a little strange, but you're looking for a lot of contrast in the image and the features that you care about. So you pull through these and then you go, okay, it looks strange. That's not a problem. We're going to come here to blending mode. We're going to go down to soft light. And that is going to be too strong, always. So what I want to do is I want to take my opacity right the way down, and I'm going to dial this in until it's the strength that I want it to be. So I'm usually about 25, between 25 and 35, somewhere like that. Now, if I zoom in, let's zoom back in on the eye here again. And I'm just going to show you what this black and white layer set to soft light, 30% opacity is doing. Can you see that? Just on everything that's dark, very dark in particular, and it's leaving the midtones and highlights alone pretty much, but it's just adding a bit of crunch to everything that's dark in the image just because of that blending mode. So again, that's already looking much better. Let's turn those off. That's just a little bit of edge sharpening which you need to zoom in to see. Just that extra fine detail contrast, and then my fine detail contrast is coming in, just adding some nice darkness to these lashes and this hair and the eyebrows. Okay, the next one I want to add, I'm going to add a color balance layer. This is the third sort of contrast I usually use. So we're just going to call this color contrast. And the trick with this layer is that I'm going to add in opposite colors on the color wheel into different tones within the image. So first of all, let's go down to shadows, and you can copy this formula if you want or work out your own. But what I normally do is add -5 on this top layer. So I'm pushing cyan into the shadows, and then I'm going to add 5 to my yellow blue slider, also pushing blue into the shadows. So I push cyan and I push blue into the shadows. Now I'm going to change this to my midtones, and this is going to create contrast between my shadows and midtones. I'm going to go -5 on the yellow and 5 on the red, and what that's done is it's pushed cool tones into the shadows and it's pushed warmer tones into my midtones. I could do the same again with the highlights and add some warmth to the highlights, but in this case I'm going to leave it alone. And if I turn this layer on and off, you can see that it's added contrast to the image, but it's done it by pushing opposite colors into different tonal values within the image. And the reason this is great is because what you want to be careful of when you're adding contrast, and all three ways we've done this so far, we protected our highlights, we haven't blown anything out. If you just jack a contrast slider up, then you're going to lose all the tones because it's going to blow out your highlights and it's going to push down your shadows and your contrast and everything and lose detail. But all three ways we've used so far is just subtly add a contrast in, but we're protecting our tonal value. Let me show you what it would do actually, just to give you interest. If I just add a literal contrast layer over the top, I turn these on and off, the ones underneath off. So we're just on this contrast layer. If I push this contrast layer up, you can see it's oversaturating all those tones, and we're starting to lose stuff pretty fast. We're starting to color burn all over the place. We don't have very much control. But if I've added these layers so far, you can see we're controlling it, we're controlling the color, and we're keeping we've got loads of latitude still in our highlights and shadows that we can play with. And then the fourth way we're going to add contrast is to add a curves layer. And on my curve, let's just name this curves contrast. Okay, and the curves are a great tool because you can kind of intuitively pull in the amount of contrast you want to see in the image. Let me just show you, first of all, I want to use curves on a particular blending mode. If I just create a standard S curve which pulls contrast in, okay, I've pushed it too far deliberately to show you, but you can see if I just add a curves layer like this, I have kind of destroyed the color. I've oversaturated it because of adding that contrast. But if I change my blend mode on my curve to luminosity, I'm telling it to only add contrast and not to mess too much with the colors. All right, so if I just get rid of these, So now that it's on luminosity, I can create a point at my third here and third here. I'll explain quickly what curves does. Basically, your x-axis along here just has your blacks at the bottom here, your shadows, your midtones, your highlights, and your white point. Okay, and above on your y-axis here, if you push values on any of these points, because this is where your image is lying at the moment along this center point, and this in the background is just your histogram, so you can see kind of what you're affecting and how you're changing things. If I take my shadows, for example, and I push them up, then it's going to increase the tonal value. It's going to push my shadows brighter. Again, so if I just create the 5 points, now I've got my white point, my highlights, my midtones, my shadows, and my blacks. And now I'm going to create a very, very standard, this is a very quick and easy way to create contrast, is just to pull my shadows down a touch. Again, being very careful about how much I want to lose and how much I want to increase, and then slightly increasing my highlights is going to create that. And here I'm very carefully watching my highlights on the face. I don't want those blown. Then taking my midtones and just making sure that the roll off is nice and it's creating something pleasing. There's no formula for this. This is going to be done the way you want to do it. So you're going to have to create these points and pull them. And again, for this kind of thing, less is definitely more. Pull less so you don't have to come back and correct it later, and don't overdo it. So again, this curves layer is adding a macro contrast over the whole image. We're now affecting the whole image. We're not affecting edge detail. We're not just affecting highlight shadows. We're telling it what we want it to do with the shadows and midtones and the highlights across the whole image. And then the last thing that I do, and this is really just to check my contrast, is to add a levels layer. We'll just call it levels contrast for this, but we're not actually often at this stage. I'm not adding contrast at this stage. I'm checking contrast. It can be a way to add it, but it can be a way also to take it back, and I'll show you what I mean. So if I hold Alt, again, this is my histogram, this is my white point and my midtones and my black point down the bottom. And I'm basically saying I want to, if I pull my midtones like this across, I'm saying I want to include more of those midtones into the highlight region, and I'm brightening things up. If I take my black point and pull it up, I'm saying that I want to put more of these black tones outside of this tonal range, which means they're going to fall to black. Again, with the white point, if I pull it across, I'm saying I want this information to be brighter and outside of that white range, so I'm just pulling it across. If I hold Alt, and I grab my highlight point like this, I can already see the areas that are blown out on the image. So you can see on her shoulder here and at the top here, I can see I've already blown those details to white. So I now need to be careful. I probably don't want to increase this anymore. You can see here, it's telling you it's starting to burn out detail on the face. If I pull all this back so that I've hardly moved it at all. I'm finding this a little hot on the face, so to be honest on this one, I probably wouldn't move my highlight slider. But if I found I had some latitude and wanted to pull it across more, I could. Now if I hold Alt and hold my black point here at the bottom, start to dial it to the right, I can see when I'm starting to completely let things fall to black and lose all detail. I don't want to do this in this image this much, but I might just want to do a little bit. So let's pull it to 5. I can see while I'm holding Alt that I'm not losing any shadow detail in this whole area, so I'm totally safe. I've still got all the detail in there. So if I pull that to 5, I quite like what that's doing. So that's just adding a tiny bit of pop at the end. So if I take all these layers off, let's start from the beginning with what we've done. A little bit of extra fine detail to add that sharpness. A bit of fine detail on the edges with that black and white layer. Some color contrast by pushing color into different sections, and I'm controlling it at each stage. A bit of curves over the whole image just to sort of give that final look and dial that contrast in, and that levels contrast, just punching in that final bit but making sure I'm not losing any detail. So now if I zoom in on the eye, say for example, let's do that again for you just so you can see close up. So there's my fine edge contrast, there's my fine detail contrast, there is my color contrast going in, that's my curves contrast, and then my levels contrast at the end where I'm adding that final bit but making sure I'm not losing any detail just by holding Alt. And that means that I've gone from an image which looked fairly flat because the light was wrapping around, even though it looks nice, and I've slowly added in the amount of contrast that I want. Okay, so let's look at another example where I can show you black and white. So we're going to start with the same process again. So we're going to duplicate, and we're going to go to filter, and we're going to go down to high pass. I don't want to reapply the high pass I used before because I want to customize it for this image. I'm going to find that eye, and again I'm going to dial this radius until I get those nice fine black lines, and 2.5 is looking pretty good. Again, I'm going to move faster now because we've been through this. So I'm going to go to overlay, I'm going to zoom in and just check how much that's adding. That looks good to me. The image was slightly soft anyway, so this is helping me a little bit, that fine edge contrast, and bringing back those nice sharp edges. If you do use this for portraits, just be aware that it's also going to sharpen your skin detail and give contrast on your skin detail, which you might not want. All you would do is add a mask and then you paint black over the skin, so you'd mask out the skin detail and just be applying the sharpness to the eye and the hair and everything else. Okay, so we've got that. I'm going to dial it back just a touch because the hair is looking slightly over sharp and over contrasty. Okay, then I'm going to go Command-Alt-Shift-E, Control-Alt-Shift-E on a Windows or a Mac, on a PC rather, and that's just going to stamp visible everything underneath. It's going to put on top. I'm going to come over here to Image, Adjustments, and go down to Black and White. And again here, I'm going to pull my reds down so that it's going to create some of that nice skin contrast that I want to see. Push my yellows up, and in this case, because the background's green, I'm going to darken that green right down. It's starting to break up just a touch, so I don't want this to sort of fall apart. I'm going to go OK, and then I'm going to change this to soft light. Exactly the same process again. Dial this opacity down to 0 and just bring it in to taste. So that's adding that nice sort of fine edge contrast to the image. Yeah, about 26 is good. I always find between sort of 20 and 35, somewhere in that range. Any more than that and it starts to look a bit crazy. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Okay, normally now I go to my color contrast, but because this is a black and white, I'm going to create an actual black and white layer. So now I want the image to look good as a black and white. I can't be playing with it to add lots of crazy contrast. Now I actually want to fine tune this as a black and white image. So I still will dial my reds to the left and my yellow to the right just to give some nice detail there in the face, and probably just darken my background down a little bit, and that's looking fairly good. Then I'm going to go to my curves layer like last time. I'm going to add my points in here just so I can start playing, and I'm going to push my highlights up a touch. Again, I'm watching that skin detail. I don't want to lose anything in there, and start to bring. I'm going to make this quite a contrasty image just so you can see how far we can sort of take this. And that's looking fairly good. I'm going to bring my midtones down just a touch just to give some nice roll off. I'm always looking for how these gradients transition. I don't want any, if I pull this too much, you can see it's going to start to look strange in there, a little weird. So I'm going to push this back up a little bit so that roll off from the highlights to the shadows looks pretty good. I'm going to pull this down a touch. Looking good. And then I'm going to come to my levels layer for the last one. Again, I'm going to hold Alt and I'm going to take my highlights and pull them across. And I can see I've actually got lots of wiggle room in here, so I really am going to pull this time. I'm going to pull it until I start to see something loose. So that top left corner there, where the sun is coming over his shoulder, you can see that's the first thing to go. So I'm going to pull it until just when I start to lose that, and I'm going to back it off a touch. Okay, it's looking good. So now I know that all my tones are represented. Even this sun that's coming over his shoulder is still not blown to pure white, but I've pulled in some highlight contrast, which means I've taking this to 248 in this case. I'm going to do the same for the shadows, hold Alt and grab my shadows and pull up, and there on the shirt at the bottom I'm starting to lose them. So I'm going to back this up a bit. Again, I want contrast, but in my case I don't really want to lose a load of detail. So that is looking a little too strong for me. I'm going to back it a little bit out, so I'm going to take this shadow detail to about 7. So let's turn all these off. We've started with an image which looks pretty good, but we want that nice contrasty black and white. So we went in, let's just go in right close so you can see what we've done. We went in, we added that very, very fine edge contrast, that sharpening. Then we added some nice detail contrast with that black and white layer set to soft light mode. We turned it to black and white and played with the contrast slightly by playing with different color channels on our black and white. We had that nice overall contrast with our curves, sort of dialed it into taste, and then we played just at the end with that levels layer, making sure we didn't lose any detail with that kind of global contrast again. And let's turn all those on from a distance. You can see just that fine edge. You won't be able to see at this distance. That nice edge detail, that edge contrast with that black and white layer. The black and white conversion, and we've added contrast in here a touch as well by playing with those colors, different channels. We've added those nice curves which sort of sets our mood and like gives us a nice global contrast. And then on that levels layer, we just fine tune it right at the end there, making sure we keep all that detail. And that's how you control your contrast, by bringing it in layers as you work through your image. And this means that you're not going to overcook it by just cranking one contrast slider up. You're bringing it in by adding layers one at a time, changing the opacity of some of these layers. You can even go back after the fact and sort of play with each of these layers because you're not quite happy with the contrast, and dial that opacity in so that you're bringing it in as much or as little as you want and creating an image that you feel really pops, but that you've custom contrasted from start to finish.